The stagecoach had barely rolled to a stop when Hazel Bell saw him. He was standing apart from the small crowd gathered at the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, his broad-shouldered frame cutting a solitary figure against the blaze of the late afternoon sun. His hat was in his hand, held against his chest like a man at a funeral, and there was something in the rigid set of his jaw, something in the careful, controlled stillness of him, that told her immediately this man was not here by accident. He was waiting for someone. She stepped down from the coach with her traveling bag clutched in both hands, her green eyes scanning the dusty Main Street, the hitching posts, the saloon with its crooked sign, the general store with barrels stacked on the porch, looking for any familiar face from the correspondence she had carried folded inside her coat pocket for the past 3 weeks. There was no familiar face. There was only this man with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed directly on her. Then she saw the name on the paper he held in his other hand, angled slightly downward as if he had not wanted anyone else to see it. Her name, Hazel Bell, written in a hand she did not recognize. The betrayal arrived before she could even draw a breath to speak, because the letter tucked inside her own coat pocket, the one she had read 17 times on the swaying journey from St. Louis, was signed by a man named Calhoun Briggs, who had promised her a home in Ellsworth, who had sent her a train ticket and a stage connection, who had described himself in neat, slanting letters as a man of modest but honest means. And this man standing before her, this broad-shouldered rancher with the quiet eyes and the hat pressed to his chest, was not Calhoun Briggs. The sign on the stage behind her read Caldwell, not Ellsworth. She had boarded the wrong stage entirely. And the right rancher was already waiting. His name, as she would come to learn, was Joel Sawyer, and the moment their eyes met across that dusty strip of Kansas earth, something happened that neither of them had planned for, something that cut right through the confusion and the embarrassment and the very obvious fact that she was not supposed to be here, and he was not supposed to be looking at her like that, like she was something he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting at all. He stepped forward. His boots raised small clouds of dust. He held the paper out and she could see his name written below hers in the same hand, this strange letter that had brought them both to the same wrong place at the same right moment. "Miss Bell," he said, and his voice was low and careful, the voice of a man who chose his words the way other men chose their footing in dark territory. "I believe there's been a considerable mistake." She lifted her chin. "Several, I imagine." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost, and that was where it began. Not with roses or whispered promises, or the kind of romantic introduction she had imagined when she had first answered the advertisement in the St. Louis Gazette 3 months earlier. It began with dust and a wrong stage, and a man holding his hat in his hand like an apology waiting to be delivered, and Hazel Bell standing in the middle of a street in a town she had never intended to visit with no money for a return fare and no idea what came next. But first, she needed to understand how she had arrived here, and so did he. 6 weeks before that afternoon in Caldwell, Hazel Bell had been seated at the narrow writing desk in her room above her aunt's dress shop in St. Louis, Missouri, reading through the matrimonial advertisements in the back pages of the Gazette with the particular focus of a woman who has run out of easier options. She was 26 years old, which in 1882 placed her squarely in the category that polite society called a woman of independent circumstance, and less polite society called something considerably less charitable. Her parents were gone, her aunt was generous but aging, and the dress shop provided just enough work to keep Hazel busy and just too little money to keep her secure. She was not desperate. That was the important distinction she made to herself, then and later. She was practical. There was a difference. The advertisement that had caught her eye had been specific in ways that other advertisements were not. It had not promised wealth or vast holdings. It had not described the author as a gentleman of refined sensibilities. It had simply said that a man of 30 in Ellsworth, Kansas, named Calhoun Briggs, was seeking a capable woman of good character for honest partnership in building a life on the frontier. The word partnership had been the thing that stopped her. Not wife, not companion, partnership. She had written back. He had replied. 3 letters had passed between them over the following 2 months, each one a little more specific, a little more real. He had told her about his land, a modest parcel outside Ellsworth where he ran a small cattle operation. She had told him about her background in sewing and bookkeeping, her experience managing the dress shop accounts, her ability to stretch a budget further than most people would think possible. It had felt, in its careful way, like something honest being built. Then the ticket had arrived, and the connection instructions. And she had kissed her aunt on the cheek and climbed aboard the eastbound rail with her traveling bag and her good dress carefully wrapped against the dust, and her heart doing something cautious and small and hopeful in her chest. What had gone wrong was not her fault, though she would spend considerable energy in the weeks that followed deciding whether this was true. The connection instructions had listed a stage departure from Wichita on a Tuesday morning, bound for Ellsworth. What Hazel had not known, what no one had thought to tell her, was that the Tuesday stage from Wichita had 2 lines, both departing within 40 minutes of each other from platforms that were adjacent and not clearly marked. One went east toward Ellsworth. One went southwest toward Caldwell. She had asked the platform attendant which stage to take. He had pointed. He had pointed at the wrong one, possibly because he was attending to 3 things at once, possibly because he was simply careless. The result was the same. Hazel Bell climbed aboard the wrong stage, settled her bag at her feet, watched the Kansas plains roll past for 4 hours, and arrived in Caldwell believing she was in Ellsworth until the moment she stepped onto the street, and the geography did not match the description she had been given. And then there was Joel Sawyer, standing there with her name on a piece of paper and his hat in his hand. His story was different, but it intersected with hers in ways that would take time to fully understand. Joel Sawyer was 31 years old and had owned the Sawyer Ranch outside Caldwell for 6 years. He had built it himself, boards and fencing and every outbuilding, with the help of his ranch hand Deke Morrow and the occasional labor of men passing through who needed a day's pay. The ranch ran 300 head of cattle and a small but well-regarded string of horses that he sold to the Army Remount Station and to private buyers from as far away as Topeka. It was not a vast operation, but it was solid and it was his, and he had made it from almost nothing, which was a fact he carried quietly and without boasting, the way men carry facts that have cost them something real. He had no hidden motive for the advertisement. The advertisement had not been his idea, which was the first thing he told her, and the telling of it was what cracked open the story beneath the story. The advertisement had been placed by his sister, Clara Sawyer, who was 23 years old, unmarried herself, full of opinions, and deeply worried about her brother. She had watched Joel run his ranch and work his land and sit alone on his porch in the evenings for 3 years since the death of his wife, Margaret, and she had decided that what Joel needed was not more time alone with his cattle and his silence. What he needed was someone. She had placed the advertisement without telling him. She had conducted the correspondence with Hazel Bell under a false name, Calhoun Briggs, which was a name she had invented from a combination of a street she had once walked down and the surname of a schoolteacher she had admired. She had written letters she was proud of. She had arranged the ticket and the stage connection. She had made one critical error. When she had written the stage connection instructions, she had written Caldwell instead of Ellsworth, because Caldwell was where Joel's ranch was, and she had been thinking about the destination while writing the departure, and the mistake had slipped through uncorrected. Joel had discovered all of this 4 days before Hazel arrived, when Clara had finally confessed, flushed and defiant and not quite apologetic enough to satisfy him. He had been furious. He had said things that were honest and not kind. He had spent 2 days deciding what to do. He had decided, finally, that the only decent thing was to be at the stage himself, To meet this woman he had not invited and explain what had happened, to give her any help he could in getting to wherever she was actually supposed to be going, and to make absolutely clear to his sister that he would handle his own life from here forward. He had not expected Hazel Bell. He had expected someone to be angry at Clara. He had expected paperwork and awkwardness, and the considerable expense of arranging a corrected journey. He had not expected a woman with green eyes and a lifted chin who looked at the dust and the wrong town and the stranger holding her name on a piece of paper, and said, with no tremor in her voice at all, that there had been several mistakes, as if she was already calculating how to address each one. They stood on the street in the thinning afternoon light while the other stage passengers collected their belongings and dispersed, and Joel told her everything. He told it plainly, without softening it, because she deserved that. He told her about Clara, about the false name, about the wrong directions, about the fact that there was no Calhoun Briggs anywhere in Kansas as far as he knew. He watched her face while he spoke. She was very controlled. Only her hands moved, her fingers tightening slightly on the strap of her traveling bag. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to make him genuinely uncertain. "Your sister," she said finally. "Yes." She placed the advertisement, conducted the letters. "Sent the ticket?" "Yes." "Without your knowledge, without my knowledge or consent." Another silence. A wagon rolled past them on the street, its wheels loud on the packed earth. "What did she think was going to happen?" Hazel asked. Joel looked at the hat in his hands. "I believe she thought I would fall in love with whoever showed up." The bluntness of it surprised her. She looked at him sharply, searching for condescension or mockery, and found neither. He was simply being honest. "That is either very romantic or very alarming," she said. "I've been going back and forth on which one," he admitted. That was the moment. Not dramatic, not accompanied by music or weather. Just two people standing in the dust of a Kansas street, telling each other the truth, and something quiet and significant shifting between them. But Hazel was not a woman who let quiet, significant moments make decisions for her. She had a situation to address. She was in the wrong town with no money for a return or forward fare. Her trunk had likely been offloaded in Ellsworth by now, and she was supposed to meet a man named Calhoun Briggs who did not exist. "I need to send a telegram," she said, "to correct the situation in Ellsworth if there is anyone actually expecting me there." "There isn't," Joel said. "The advertisement was placed here out of the Caldwell paper. No one in Ellsworth knows your name." This was both a relief and a fresh complication. She thought through it. "Then I need to contact my aunt in St. Louis. And I need somewhere to stay tonight. The Caldwell Hotel is decent. I can cover your room." He said it quickly before she could react. "Not as a debt between us. As the least I can do, given that my sister arranged to drop a stranger in a strange town under false pretenses." She studied him for another moment. "I'll accept that," she said carefully, "and I'll repay it when I'm able. You don't need to." "I said I'll repay it," she said, and there was something in her voice that made it clear this was not a negotiation. He nodded, accepting this. "The hotel is at the far end of Main Street. Let me carry your bag. I'm managing it fine." "I know you are," he said. "I just thought I'd offer." She almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. He walked her to the hotel. He arranged the room with the proprietress, Mrs. Adeline Hooper, a large, kind woman who looked at Hazel with the practiced eye of someone who had seen many kinds of travelers and was currently categorizing this one. He paid for 2 nights, overriding Hazel's objection with the simple logic that it would take at least that long to sort out the next practical steps. At the door of the hotel, he put his hat back on his head, and the transformation was subtle but real. With the hat off, he had seemed, somehow, more open, more uncertain, more human. With it on, he was a rancher, purposeful and contained, a man with land to manage and an early morning ahead of him. "I'll come by tomorrow with a plan," he said, "if that's agreeable." "What kind of plan?" "For getting you where you need to go, or resolving what the next step is." He paused. "Whatever that turns out to be." She nodded. "I'll be here." He touched the brim of his hat, which she would come to learn was his version of a bow, and walked away down the street. And Hazel Bell stood in the doorway of the Caldwell Hotel and watched him go, and told herself very firmly that she was not feeling anything in particular. She did not sleep well. The room was clean and the bed was adequate, and the noise from the saloon 2 buildings down was not overwhelming, but her mind would not quiet. She lay in the narrow bed and reviewed her circumstances with the methodical detachment she had always used when reality was more complex than she preferred. She was stranded. She was dependent, at least temporarily, on a stranger's charity. The life she had been building toward in her letters to the fictional Calhoun Briggs, the partnership, the frontier home, the practical future, was a fiction from the ground up. But she was alive. She was unharmed. She was in a decent room in a functioning town. And the man who had met her at the stage had told her the truth when he could have constructed any number of easier stories. She folded the letter from Calhoun Briggs carefully and placed it on the nightstand. Then she unfolded it again and read it one more time. She could hear Joel Sawyer's voice in it now that she knew. Not the surface words, which were careful and well composed, but the underlying character. His sister had written these letters, but she had been writing about him, about the land he had built, about the honest partnership he had offered without knowing he was offering it. That was the thought that kept her awake longest. Clara Sawyer arrived at the hotel before her brother the next morning. She was smaller than Hazel had imagined from the force of her letters, not physically slight exactly, but compact and quick, with dark hair and her brother's same careful eyes deployed at a much faster speed. She knocked on Hazel's door at 8 o'clock with the expression of someone who has been rehearsing an apology and is not entirely convinced it will land correctly. "Miss Bell," she said, "I'm Clara Sawyer. And I owe you a great deal more than an apology, but I'll start there." Hazel studied her. She was not particularly angry. She thought she should be, and had been testing the anger the night before, pressing at it to see how solid it was. But it kept softening at the edges, because the letters had been honest, even if the name had been false. Because whatever scheme Clara had set in motion, she had set it in motion for reasons that were not selfish, which was unusual in Hazel's experience. "Come in," she said. Clara came in and sat in the room's single chair, and told her story with the same blunt speed her brother had used on the street, as if they had been raised in the same school of just say it plainly. She told Hazel about Joel's wife, Margaret, who had died of fever in the winter of 1879, 3 years after their marriage, having been on the frontier long enough to love it but not long enough to make something lasting with it. She told Hazel that Joel had never recovered his willingness to look forward, that he worked and he maintained and he sat on his porch and he was good to the people around him, but he had stopped reaching for anything. He had stopped expecting his life to change. "I did a wrong thing," Clara said. "I know that. I arranged a correspondence under false pretenses and I sent a woman across 3 states on a lie. That was wrong. But everything I said about who Joel is, that was true, every word." "Why Calhoun Briggs?" Hazel asked. Clara looked briefly embarrassed. "I couldn't use Joel's name. He would have found out immediately. Someone in town would have mentioned it. Calhoun was a street in Jefferson City where I lived before I moved here. Briggs was my schoolteacher who I liked very much. I just needed a name." "You put considerable thought into this deception." "I put considerable thought into my brother's happiness," Clara said. "The deception was a practical necessity." Hazel looked at her for a long moment. "You're very sure of yourself for someone in a considerable amount of trouble." Clara met her eyes without flinching. "I'm sure that Joel needs something he won't seek for himself. Whether it's you specifically or someone like you, I don't know, but I was not willing to let him spend another 3 years on that porch alone." The silence that followed was thoughtful rather than hostile. "He's coming at 10 to discuss the practical arrangements," Hazel said finally. "We should probably both be civil." "I'm always civil," Clara said. "You impersonated a man and sent me to the wrong state." "I was civil about it," Clara said, and her mouth curved, and Hazel felt the laugh rise in her chest before she stopped it. Joel arrived at 10 with his hat in his hand again, which Hazel was beginning to understand was not nervousness but respect, a deliberate gesture of deference he used when he knew he was entering someone else's territory. He looked at his sister with the expression of a man who has made peace with something he is still not entirely at peace with. "You're here early," he said to Clara. "I had things to say." "Did you say them?" "Some of them." He looked at Hazel. "I've spoken to Ben Alcott, who runs the freight operation here. He goes to Wichita on Thursday and could take you as far as the rail depot. From there, it's a straightforward connection back to St. Louis." He produced a folded paper from his coat pocket. "I've written out the route and the connection points, and I can give you the fare for the train." Hazel looked at the paper. She looked at him. She looked at the neat, careful lines of the route he had written out. She thought about the dress shop in St. Louis, about her aunt's generous smallness, about the narrow room above the shop where she had read through the back pages of the Gazette looking for something that felt like a future. "That's very thorough," she said. "It's the least I can do." "You keep saying that." He looked slightly uncertain. "Because it keeps being true." She set the paper down on the nightstand next to the folded letter from Calhoun Briggs. She was quiet for long enough that both Joel and Clara were watching her with carefully identical expressions of restrained concern. "I have a question," she said. "Ask it," Joel said. "The advertisement, the one your sister placed, the specific wording of it, was she accurate about what you need? About what the ranch is and what kind of partnership it could offer?" Joel went very still. It was the stillness she was coming to recognize as his version of being caught off guard. A complete cessation of movement, rather than the flinching or deflecting that other people did. "That's not a question I expected," he said. "I'm aware." He looked at Clara. Clara looked at the ceiling with great interest. "She was accurate," he said slowly. "About the ranch, about what the work requires, about the kind of life it is." He paused. "The word partnership was mine, actually. She said she had trouble writing it to sound honest, so she asked me once, hypothetically, how I would describe what I was looking for, and I said partnership. I didn't know she was writing it down." Hazel filed this away carefully. "And the letter you wrote about what it means to build something together, about trust being more important than sentiment." Something moved in his expression that was too complicated to name quickly. "That was also mine. She read me a letter she said a friend of hers had written, and asked what I thought was missing from it, and I talked for about 20 minutes apparently, and she took notes." "Your sister is very resourceful," Hazel said. "My sister is a menace," Joel said, with enough fondness in the word that it was clearly not entirely a complaint. Hazel picked up the paper he had given her and looked at it again. Then she put it in her coat pocket and said something that surprised all three of them, including herself. "Before I decide about Thursday's stage, I'd like to see the ranch." The silence that followed was complete. "Why?" Joel asked. "Because I've been corresponding with it for 2 months," she said. "Even if the correspondence wasn't quite what I thought it was, the place is real. I'd like to see if it matches what I was told." Joel looked at her for a long moment with those careful, quiet eyes. Then he said, "I can bring the wagon around after noon." Clara Sawyer waited until her brother had gone back down the stairs before she turned to Hazel Bell with an expression that was equal parts triumph and genuine bewilderment. "You're not going to Thursday's stage," she said. It was not a question. "I haven't decided anything," Hazel said. "You've decided something." "I've decided to look at a piece of land before I make a final judgment," Hazel said firmly. "That is all." But Clara's expression did not change. The ride out to the Sawyer ranch took 40 minutes in Joel's buckboard wagon, along a track that was rough but well-worn, cutting south from Caldwell through open grassland that rolled in long waves under the early April wind. The sky above Kansas in April was enormous, a pale, wide blue with clouds moving fast and low, throwing shadows across the grass that swept and shifted like something living. Hazel sat on the bench beside Joel and held her coat closed against the wind and did not speak for the first 10 minutes because the land was doing something to her that she needed to observe privately. She had grown up in cities. She had never lived anywhere that did not have walls and roof lines defining the horizon. This was different. This was the world with its edges removed. "You're quiet," Joel said. "I'm looking." "At what?" "At everything." She gestured at the horizon. "How far does your land extend?" He pointed left and right, describing the boundaries, and she tried to hold the dimensions in her mind and found she couldn't quite. It was too large for her to make concrete. Back in St. Louis, the dimensions of her existence had been very specific. The shop, the room above, the 2 blocks she walked to church on Sundays. This was something of a different order altogether. The ranch house appeared as they crested a low ridge, and it was not what she had imagined. She had imagined something rough and half-built, the frontier homestead of illustrated adventure stories. What she saw was solid and square and clean, a 2-story clapboard house with a covered porch running the full length of the front, flanked by a barn and 3 outbuildings in good repair, with a fence line running straight and true on 3 sides and a kitchen garden on the southern face of the house that was just beginning to show the dark-turned earth of spring preparation. "You built this yourself," she said. "Most of it. Deke helped with the 2nd story." She looked at the garden. "Who manages that?" He paused. "It's been fallow for 2 years. Margaret had it. I've kept the ground turned, but I haven't planted." She heard what was under the words and said nothing, which was the right thing to do. They walked through the house. It was clean in the way that a man's house is clean when he is disciplined but not domestic. Everything in its place. Nothing unnecessary. No color or softness anywhere except for a single curtain in the front window that was clearly older than the rest of the interior and had probably not been chosen by the man who now lived here alone. There was a kitchen with good equipment, a front room with 2 chairs, and a bookshelf that Hazel looked at with interest. A study with a desk covered in papers that represented, she could see at a glance, the complex arithmetic of a working cattle operation. 2 bedrooms upstairs. "The books," she said in the front room. "Are these yours?" "Most of them. Some were Margaret's." He hesitated. "I haven't moved them." She looked at the spines without touching them. History, survey maps, a battered almanac from 3 years past, 2 novels she recognized from her aunt's collection. A book of poetry that surprised her enough to make her look at him quickly. He caught her looking. "Margaret's," he said. "Is it?" He looked at the shelf. "Actually," he said, "it might be mine. I'm not certain anymore." She turned back to the window and looked at the kitchen garden. She was thinking, with a precision that she recognized as the part of her that had always been more practical than sentimental, about the numbers. She had no money for a return fare on her own. Her aunt in St. Louis was generous and aging, and the dress shop would always be a dress shop. The life she had come here to find, the partnership, the something real and forward-looking, had been built on false correspondence, but it had been built on truth about this place and this man. And Joel Sawyer was standing 3 feet away from her in this solid, quiet house that he had built with his own hands, looking at a book of poetry and trying to remember if it was his. And she had known him for less than a day, and she already understood him more clearly than she had understood most people she had known for years. This was the dangerous thought. She was aware that it was dangerous. She catalogued it carefully and moved on. "I'd like to see the horses," she said. He showed her the horses. He was a different person with the horses, less contained, more expressive, his hands moving with a confidence and ease that he kept out of his voice. He introduced her to each of them by name and explained their histories with the kind of detail that people use when they are talking about things they love without wanting to say that directly. She watched his face while he talked. She watched his hands on the horse's flanks. His ranch hand Deke Morrow came in from the south pasture while they were in the corral, a weather-beaten man of about 50 with a careful, assessing eye that took Hazel in without making her feel assessed. He shook her hand with the matter-of-fact courtesy of someone who had been raised to treat all strangers as they presented themselves, until they gave reason to do otherwise. "You're the one from the stage," Deke said. "I am," Hazel said. He nodded slowly. "Boss said there'd been a mix-up. Several, she said, and Deke looked at Joel, and something passed between them in the language of men who have worked together long enough to have a private vocabulary. They ate supper that evening at the long kitchen table, a simple meal that Joel had prepared with the efficient, no-nonsense cooking of a man who eats to work rather than for pleasure, beef and beans and fresh bread that turned out to be better than the rest of the meal suggested it would be. Clara had ridden out in the afternoon on her own horse, and was now sitting at the end of the table conducting what Hazel recognized as a very elaborate attempt to appear, as though she was not watching both of them constantly. Hazel asked Joel about the cattle operation over supper. She asked specific questions, about numbers and costs, and the market prices he was getting, about the army contracts and the private buyers, about the cash reserves and the debt structure. He answered all of it directly, without the condescension that men sometimes used when women asked about money, and without the false modesty that men sometimes used when they wanted to appear humble while actually boasting. He just answered. She noticed things in the answers that she filed for later consideration. "You're doing the accounting in your head," he said at one point. "I'm good with numbers," she said. "Your letters mentioned that," he said, and then caught himself. "Clara's letters, the letters she wrote, but they described you accurately." "She had a good source," Hazel said dryly. He almost smiled again. She was noticing that he almost smiled considerably more than he actually smiled, and she was beginning to wonder what it would take to get a full one. After supper, Clara offered to wash the dishes in a gesture that was so obviously designed to give Hazel and Joel a moment alone that both of them looked at her with identical expressions of weary recognition. Clara met their eyes with blameless innocence and began pumping water at the kitchen sink. They went out to the porch. The Kansas night was enormous and cold and absolutely crowded with stars. Hazel had never seen stars like this. She stood on the porch of the Sawyer ranch and looked up at the sky and felt something in her chest open that she had not known was closed. Joel stood beside her, not close, a respectful distance that was the distance of a careful man, and looked at the stars with her in silence for a long moment. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I'm thinking that I've been practical my whole life," she said, "and I'm wondering if that's a virtue or a limitation." He considered this. "Could be both." "That's not a comforting answer." "I'm not trying to be comforting, I'm trying to be honest." She turned her head and looked at him. He was looking at the stars. The cold light caught the planes of his face, and she could see the exhaustion in him. Not tonight's exhaustion, but the deeper kind, the kind that accumulates across years. "Tell me about Margaret," she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not. Then he said, "She was brave. She came out here from Ohio, and she was not prepared for it, and she was not going to let that stop her. She planted that garden the first spring and half of it died, and she replanted it. She laughed at the things that scared her." He paused. "She died in February. The fever came fast. 3 days and then she was gone." He said this last part without inflection, the way people say things they have said to themselves so many times the words have worn smooth. "I don't talk about it as a rule." "Why are you talking about it now?" He looked at her. "Because you asked," he said. "And because you didn't ask to be gentle, you asked because you wanted to know." She held his gaze. "I did want to know. I know." They stood on the porch until the cold drove Hazel inside, and Joel walked her to where the wagon was hitched, and they rode back to Caldwell in the dark with the stars above and the wind moving through the grass, and Hazel making no decision at all, which was itself a kind of decision. She did not take Thursday's stage. She told Mrs. Hooper she would need the room for another week, and paid for it herself with the last of the emergency money she had sewn into the hem of her traveling bag. And she told no one her reasons, because she had not yet found words for them that she trusted. She spent that first week learning Caldwell. It was a cattle town, a shipping point where the cattle drives from Texas terminated before the beef went east by rail. It was rougher than it looked on first arrival and more organized than it looked from the surface. There was a sheriff named Bart Meadows who was capable and occasionally overworked. There was a church, 2 saloons, a livery, the general store run by a cheerful woman named Nora Twig who knew everything about everyone and was not shy about sharing it. There was a small school that operated 3 days a week for want of a full-time teacher. There was also, Hazel discovered on her third day in town, a woman named Vera Lind who had known Joel Sawyer for several years and had opinions about the woman staying at the hotel who had arrived on the wrong stage. Hazel encountered Vera at the general store while buying thread and paper, and the basic supplies she would need for an extended stay. Vera was handsome and confident, and made it extremely clear within the first 3 minutes of conversation that she considered Joel Sawyer's welfare to be something of a personal concern. "He's had a hard time of it," Vera said, ostensibly helping Hazel locate the correct spool of thread. "He doesn't need complications." "I'm not planning to be a complication," Hazel said. "Intentions don't determine outcomes," Vera said pleasantly, "especially for women passing through." Hazel set her thread on the counter and turned to face Vera directly. "Are you warning me off, or are you trying to learn something about my intentions?" Vera blinked. She had not expected this directness. "Both," she said, with a slight recalibration of her expression that Hazel recognized as respect. "Then I'll be direct. I'm not passing through as of this moment. I'm here for reasons that are my own until I decide otherwise. Joel Sawyer has been nothing but decent and honest with me. I have no intention of treating him otherwise." She picked up her thread. "Is there anything else I can help you find?" Vera looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled, and it was an actual smile without social architecture. "He's a good man," she said. "I know," Hazel said. She walked back to the hotel in the April afternoon thinking about what she knew and what she still needed to learn. And she was halfway down the street when she heard her name and turned to find Joel walking toward her from the livery. His horse hitched behind him, his hat on this time business mode. But there was something in his face when he looked at her that was different from how he had looked at her yesterday. Or she was reading things in his face that weren't there, which was also possible. "You didn't take the stage," he said. "I didn't." He stood still for a moment, processing this. "Are you planning to stay?" "I'm planning to see," she said. He nodded slowly. "Then I have a proposal, a practical one." She raised an eyebrow. "The ranch accounts are a mess," he said. "I can run cattle and I can manage horses and I know how to read weather and land better than most men in this county. But the books are 3 months behind and the Army contract renewal is in 6 weeks and the paperwork alone is going to cost me a week I don't have." He held her gaze evenly. "You said you're good with numbers." "I am," she said. "I can pay a fair wage," he said. "For the bookkeeping, it doesn't obligate either of us to anything beyond the work itself." She studied him. He meant this. He was not using the work as a pretext. He was a man who needed a bookkeeper and happened to know someone qualified who was currently resident in his town, and he was being straightforward about it. But she also knew, and she was fairly certain he knew, that nothing between them was purely practical anymore, and hadn't been since the porch and the stars and the conversation about Margaret. The practical framing was real and honest, and also a door they were both choosing to walk through because neither of them was the kind of person who could say the other thing yet. 3 days a week, she said, to start. "That's reasonable," he said, "and I review the contract terms before I agree to the Army paperwork." "Of course. And if the accounts are as chaotic as you say, the first week is assessment only. No commitments until I understand what I'm working with." He looked at her with something that was getting close to that full smile she hadn't seen yet. "You're more like the letters than I expected," he said. "What does that mean?" "It means Clara captured something real," he said, "even working from nothing." She felt warmth move through her chest and ignored it with great deliberateness. "I'll come Monday," she said. She came Monday. The accounts were every bit as chaotic as promised, and working through them was genuinely satisfying in the way that genuine competence always is. She sat up at the desk in Joel's study, with his careful permission and a cup of coffee that he brought her without being asked, and then left her alone with, which was exactly what she needed. She worked through the morning with the focused pleasure of someone doing the thing they are actually good at. sorting expenses and income and contract terms into an order that had not existed before, finding the errors, calculating the gaps, constructing a picture of the operation that was more complete and useful than what Joel had been working from. By midday, she had enough to be able to tell him that the ranch was in better shape than he knew and worse shape than he hoped, which was the usual truth about working operations. The cattle operation was solid. The horse sales were the profit margin he had been undervaluing because he hadn't been tracking them carefully against the costs. The Army contract, when she read through the renewal terms, had a clause that he had not noticed that allowed the buyer to renegotiate price on 60 days' notice, which was a hidden trap she flagged immediately. He read the flagged clause with the expression of a man who has just avoided stepping on something very sharp in the dark. "I wouldn't have caught that," he said. "You might have," she said, "but not before you signed." He looked at her across the desk. "Thank you," he said. "It's the work," she said. "Still," he said. She went back to the ledgers and he went back to the ranch, and the day passed in the productive quiet of two people working in parallel, which was its own kind of intimacy, she realized, possibly the most honest kind, two people doing real things in the same space without performance or pretense. The weeks that followed built a life out of small, honest moments. She came to the ranch 3 days a week and sometimes 4, when there was pressing work. She began to understand the rhythms of the operation, the cycles of the cattle market, the seasonal demands on the land and the hands. She talked to Deke, who talked back with the straightforward confidence of a man who had decided she was all right within the first week and saw no reason to revisit the decision. She met the 2 other part-time hands, young men named Francis and Tom, who were respectively 17 and 19, and treated her with the exaggerated courtesy of people who are uncertain of the correct social category for her. She also began to know Joel in the layered way that proximity allows. She learned that he read late into the night, that the lamp in his study window was the last one dark in the house. She learned that he could be moved to genuine laughter by specific things, the wrong word in the right place, the unexpected absurdity of a situation, and that when he laughed it transformed his face into something that she found herself looking forward to with a frequency she was monitoring carefully. She learned that he was patient with the horses in a way that went beyond professional skill into something personal, that they trusted him because they sensed something in him that was not threatening, and she thought she understood what that something was. She learned that he still carried the dark past weight of Margaret's death in his daily movements, not openly, not as an excuse, but structurally, in the way he had organized his life to leave no room for loss. He had built walls that functioned as routines. He worked them every day, and she thought that the reason he almost smiled more than he actually smiled was because a full smile required a person to be fully present in their own happiness, and he had not quite managed to believe he was allowed that yet. She was not going to push. She was not Clara. She would wait for whatever was real to become clear at its own pace, but Kansas in May was not always cooperative with caution. The trouble with Vera Lind resolved itself unexpectedly, and in a way that changed the shape of things. Vera came to Hazel at the hotel on a Thursday evening with a directness that Hazel had come to respect, and said plainly that she had been watching Joel for 2 years and trying to decide if she was in love with him or simply concerned for him, and Hazel's arrival had made it clear that it was the latter. "I care about him the way you care about someone who is also your neighbor and also your friend," Vera said. "I don't want a husband who is still in love with someone else." Hazel looked at her carefully. "Is he," she asked, "still in love with Margaret?" "He was," Vera said. "I think he's beginning to be in love with someone present." She gave Hazel a look that was very clear. "I thought you should know where you stand from my direction." Hazel said nothing for a moment. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I'd rather he be happy than lonely," Vera said. "And I think you might actually manage it, which is more than I could say for anyone else around here." She stood. "Don't make him wait too long. He'll convince himself he's fine without anything." After Vera left, Hazel sat on her hotel bed and thought for a very long time. She was in love with him. She had been trying not to notice this with considerable effort, and it had not worked at all. She was in love with him the way she had not been in love with anyone, which was to say not gently and not theoretically, but with the full particular weight of a specific person. This specific man with his careful honesty and his almost smiles and his lamp in the window and his hands on the horse's flanks. It was inconvenient and probably unwise, and she was 30 miles from where she was supposed to be in a life she had not planned, and she was more certain of this feeling than she had been of most things. The question was what to do with it. She went to the ranch on Friday as usual and worked through the morning and ate the noon meal at the table with Joel and Deke. And in the afternoon, she and Joel walked the fence line of the east pasture, because 2 of the posts had been reported as compromised after the spring wind, and it needed to be checked. They walked together in the May sun, and she looked at the grass and the sky and the cattle in the middle distance, and felt the feeling sit quietly in her chest where she had been carrying it. "Clara came to see me last night," Joel said. "What did she want?" "She wanted to know if I was planning to do anything about the situation." "What situation?" He stopped walking. She stopped beside him. The wind moved through the grass around them. "She said the situation of you being here," he said carefully, "working for me 3 days a week and neither of us apparently being willing to say the obvious thing." Hazel looked at the fence line ahead of them. One of the posts was definitely leaning. She noted this. "Your sister," she said, "is very certain about things she has no information about." "She's certain about me," he said. "She's been watching me for 31 years. "And what does she say she knows?" He turned to face her. He was not holding his hat today. He had it on, and he reached up and took it off, and there was that gesture again, hat against chest, the funeral gesture, the respectful, deliberate gesture, and she understood suddenly what it meant. It was not apology. It was reverence. It was the thing he did when he was in the presence of something he wanted to treat carefully. "She says I've been coming back to life for the past 6 weeks," he said. "And she says it's on account of you. And she says if I let you leave without saying so, she will never forgive me." He paused. "I agree with her about the last part. About forgiving you. About not letting you leave without saying something." Hazel looked at him. The sun was behind him and the sky was enormous above him, and the grass moved around them, and she thought, with the full practical clarity that had always been her strongest attribute, that this was the true thing she had been traveling toward, not the fictional Calhoun Briggs, not the Ellsworth plan, but this exact moment in this exact field. "Then say it," she said. "I'd like you to stay," he said. "Not as my bookkeeper, as something more than that, as whatever you're willing to be." He held her gaze. "I know this isn't what you planned. I know you came here under circumstances that weren't honest. I know I'm asking you to build a life in a place you didn't choose deliberately, but I'd ask you to consider it, because I think what we've been building here for the past 6 weeks is something real, and I don't want to let it go because neither of us was brave enough to say so." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved her hair. The cattle in the far pasture shifted and resettled. "I'm already staying," she said. "I decided that 3 weeks ago." He stared at her. "Then why didn't you?" "Because you needed to get there yourself," she said. "And you have, so here we are." He looked at her with an expression that was not almost a smile. It was a full one, finally, complete and unguarded, and it was everything she had suspected it would be. "Here we are," he said. He proposed formally 2 weeks later in the kitchen after supper, with a ring that had been his grandmother's and that Clara had apparently retrieved from a box in the attic without telling him she had it until he needed it, at which point she had produced it with such theatrical promptness that he had known she had been waiting for exactly this moment. Hazel accepted with a practicality and a warmth that he was beginning to understand were not contradictions in her, but the same thing expressed in different keys. They married in June at the Caldwell Church, a small ceremony attended by Clara and Deke and Nora Twigg from the general store and Sheriff Meadows and his wife and Vera Lind, who came in a very good hat and kissed Hazel on the cheek afterward and said something quietly that made Hazel laugh. Joel's pastor, a dry and good-humored man named Reverend Aldies, read the ceremony with the matter-of-fact decency of a man who married farmers and ranchers and drifters, and had learned that simplicity was usually what lasted. Hazel moved her traveling bag and the additional things she had acquired in 2 months at the hotel into the ranch house, which was an experience she approached with the deliberate care of a person who understands they are entering someone else's established space and intends to join it rather than replace it. She did not rearrange the furniture. She did not clear the bookshelf. She planted the kitchen garden, which had been waiting in turned earth for exactly this, and she did it methodically and with great satisfaction. And Joel came out and watched her and said nothing but leaned against the porch rail with his arms folded and looked at the garden coming back to life with an expression that Hazel, who was becoming fluent in his face, read clearly. The first summer was the best kind of hard. There was the Army contract negotiation, which Hazel handled with a precision that resulted in a significantly better price than the previous contract and earned her the respect of the Army buyer, a man named Captain Holt, who had not expected to be outnegotiated and had the grace to acknowledge it. There was the cattle market in late August when prices dropped, and the practical decisions had to be made about which animals to sell and which to hold. And Hazel and Joel sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers between them and worked through it together, disagreeing twice and resolving both disagreements with the kind of argument that is really just two people thinking clearly out loud. There was also the night in July when the rain came in hard from the north, and the east barn roof developed a leak that threatened the hay stores, and Joel and Deke worked through the night in the rain fixing it. And Hazel came out at 2 in the morning with coffee and lanterns and stayed until it was done. And Joel looked at her through the rain with an expression that she thought was probably the same one she was wearing. There was Clara's engagement in September to a farmer named George Haverstock from 30 miles east, a quiet and steady man who seemed to understand that marrying Clara Sawyer meant marrying someone who would always have opinions, and had made his peace with this enthusiastically. The engagement supper was at the ranch house, and it was Hazel who made it, working in the kitchen with the competence of someone who had learned the art of feeding people well from her aunt, and the table was full and loud with the specific warmth of people who have found their right configurations. And then, in October, Hazel realized she was expecting a child. She told Joel on a Sunday morning. He was sitting on the porch with his coffee, the one quiet hour of his week that she had learned to protect for him, and she came and sat beside him and told him straight, the way she told him everything. He sat very still for a moment in the way she knew meant he was processing something large. Then he set his coffee down carefully on the porch rail and turned to look at her with an expression that she had not yet seen on him, something open and undefended and overwhelmingly present. He took her hand. He held it with both of his, looking at their hands together, and she could feel him deciding to be in this moment rather than to armor himself against it, and it was the bravest thing she had ever watched anyone do. "Are you well?" he asked. "Are you feeling well?" "I'm feeling quite well," she said. He held her hand and looked at the ranch, at the kitchen garden with its late October frost beginning at the edges, at the barn and the fence line and the horizon under the gray autumn sky. She watched him look at it all as if he was seeing it arranged into a different shape, the same pieces but a new picture. "I'd like a son," he said quietly, "if that's allowed as a preference." "I believe preferences are allowed," she said. "Guarantees are a different matter." He turned and looked at her. "How are you managing the accounts this morning?" She gave him a long look. "You're asking about the accounts. I'm trying to understand how you're planning to organize the next period." "There is no emergency, Joel." "I know. I just want to understand the plan." She understood him completely. He needed to know that things were going to be managed, that the practical structure of their life was going to hold, because the emotional reality was too large to look at directly just yet, and he needed the practical scaffolding to stand on while he found his feet in it. She recognized this because she had done the same thing herself more times than she could count. "The accounts are current," she said. "The army contract runs through March. The cattle are wintered and the hay stores are full. The spring planting can wait until April." She paused. "There is nothing that will not manage." He looked at her. He was smiling completely without qualification. "I love you," he said. It was the first time he had said it, and it came out with the same directness and simplicity as everything he said, unornamented and absolutely real. She felt it land in the center of her chest, where she had been carrying the feeling since May. "I love you," she said back, and she meant it the same way, which was completely and without reservation. He put his arm around her and they sat on the porch in the October morning and looked at the ranch and the horizon, and she could feel him becoming, finally, a man who lived in his present rather than his past, who was building towards something rather than simply maintaining what was. And she thought that this was the thing Clara had known and she had taken 2 months to find out, and she forgave Clara Sawyer entirely and without remainder. The winter was good. The house was warm, and the work continued, and there were evenings by the fire with the books from the shelf between them and conversations that ranged far beyond the ranch into things they were curious about, and things they thought, and things they believed. She found that he had strong opinions about history and mathematics, and weather, and considerably less certain footing in poetry, which he had been reading in his own slow private way for years without telling anyone. She shared her opinions about it with him, and he argued back with more conviction than she had expected, and she was delighted. Clara and George were married in November, a larger wedding than Joel and Hazel's had been, with George's family traveling from the east, a cheerful crowd of people who adopted Clara with the enthusiasm of a family that had been waiting for exactly this kind of person. They settled on George's farm and Clara came to the Sawyer ranch frequently, and sometimes too frequently, and always with something to say, which was exactly as it had always been, and which Hazel had come to consider one of the better constants in her life. The son was born in May of 1883, on a morning when the kitchen garden was fully planted and the cattle were out to the spring grass, and the sky was the wide pale blue of a Kansas May. He was born with Joel's careful eyes and Hazel's pointed chin, and a set of lungs that announced his arrival to the entire ranch before the sun had fully cleared the horizon. They named him William, after Joel's father, with the middle name of Edmund, which had been Hazel's grandfather's name and which she had always thought was underused. Deke came in from the barn when the news reached him and looked at the baby with the expression of a man who does not display emotion publicly, and was currently finding this policy difficult to maintain. He said the baby looked healthy. He said this twice. He went back to the barn and was later observed doing something to a fence post with unusual vigor. Joel held his son with the same hands that worked cattle and fixed roofs and handled horses, and they were completely transformed by the holding, gentle and certain and astonished. Hazel watched him from the bed and felt the particular full satisfaction of a life that had found its right shape. "He's very small," Joel said. "They all are at the start," Hazel said. "He's going to need everything. He has everything he needs already." Joel looked at her over the baby's head, this man who had almost smiled through half of their early acquaintance and now smiled fully and often, and said, "So do I." The years moved. The ranch grew, not explosively but steadily, in the way of things that are well tended. The cattle operation expanded to 400 head. The horse program became genuinely notable, with Joel's bloodlines beginning to develop a reputation that brought buyers from further distances. Hazel managed the accounts with a precision that evolved as the operation grew, adding systems and methods that kept pace with the complexity. And she did not do this in the background. She was present for the negotiations and the contracts and the decisions, standing beside Joel as she had from the beginning as his true partner, which was the word he had used, and the word she had chosen without knowing she was choosing it. William grew with the quick, purposeful energy of a child who has been born to a place, running the ranch property with the confidence of someone who has never known a different horizon. He followed Deke everywhere, to the old ranch hand's visible but carefully unexpressed satisfaction. He had questions about everything, and he asked them with the particular fearlessness of a child raised by two people who believed that questions were how you learned things. Clara and George had a daughter in 1884, a girl they named Ruth, who arrived with Clara's speed and George's calm, an interesting combination that promised considerable entertainment in the years ahead. The two families were close in the way of families who have chosen each other rather than merely inherited the connection, and the road between the Sawyer Ranch and the Haverstock farm became well worn by regular use. There were hard years mixed with the good ones because there always are, and the drought of 1886 was genuinely difficult, a 6-month withholding of rain that cost them a third of the expected cattle income and required the kind of precise financial management that meant the difference between survival and loss. Hazel and Joel worked through it together at the kitchen table, making decisions with the frank partnership that had always been the center of what they were, and they came through it without losing the land or the core of the operation, which was more than some of their neighbors managed. The death of old Deke Morrow in the autumn of that same difficult year was a grief that was quiet and genuine. He had been with the Sawyer Ranch since its beginning, which meant he had been present for everything. He died in his bunk in the bunkhouse on a Tuesday morning in October, peacefully and without drama, which was consistent with how he had lived. Joel buried him on the ranch, on a low rise with a view of the south pasture that Deke had always favored, and the ceremony was small and honest, attended by Francis and Tom, who were both full-time hands now and who had both been shaped by their years under Deke's practical mentorship. Joel said very little at the burial and spent the following evening on the porch with his coffee and his silence, and Hazel sat beside him and held his hand and said nothing at all because she knew when he needed to talk and when he needed to simply be accompanied, and this was the latter. They sat until the stars came out and the cold drove them in, and she made hot coffee, and he said, eventually, that Deke had been one of the best men he had known, and she agreed, and that was sufficient. Hazel had a second child in 1887, a daughter this time, and they named her Alice for the lightness of it, and Alice arrived into the world with more noise and more hair than William had, and a personality that made itself clear within the first week as one that would require considerable attention and considerable patience, both of which she received without shortage. William was 4 and took the arrival of Alice with the serious responsibility of an eldest child, appointing himself her protector with a gravity that made both Joel and Hazel struggle to keep straight faces. He explained the ranch to her when she was 3 weeks old. He was very thorough. The town of Caldwell changed around them over the years. The cattle drives began to diminish as the railroads extended and the open range gave way to fenced land. The town reinvented itself slowly, as frontier towns did, the wildness settling into something more stable, the saloons becoming slightly more orderly, new businesses arriving, the school operating full-time now with a proper teacher. Sheriff Meadows retired and his deputy, a careful young man named Alvarez, took over, and he was diligent and fair, and the town continued peacefully. Hazel found herself drawn increasingly into the town's civic life, which surprised her at first and then seemed entirely natural. She helped establish a lending library in the back room of Nora Twiggs' general store, organizing the book donations and the borrowing records with the same methodical satisfaction she brought to the ranch accounts. She became involved with the school board, first as a concerned parent when William started attending, and then as a genuine participant in the conversation about what education in a frontier town should actually provide. There were injustices she saw and did not look away from. She saw the way the Comanche families who came through the region were treated by merchants who should have known better, and she said so, clearly and in public, which made certain people uncomfortable, and which she regarded as their problem to work through. She saw the way Mexican workers on the cattle drives were paid less than the Anglo hands for the same work, and she raised this with Joel, and they changed the practice on the Sawyer Ranch without announcement or fanfare, simply as a matter of what was right. She saw the way that the single women in Caldwell who worked in the saloon were regarded, and she was not naive about the circumstances that led women to that work in this time and this place, and she extended them the same courtesy she extended everyone. Joel watched all of this with the quiet pride of a man who had known from the beginning that the woman he had chosen was more than he had planned for, and had never for a moment regretted it. They celebrated 10 years on the ranch in 1892, though there was no formal anniversary to mark, only the accumulated fact of 10 years in which the ranch had grown, and the family had grown, and the life had taken on the particular richness of things that have been genuinely lived. The kitchen garden was enormous now, tended by Hazel and William and Alice, a different version of the original plantings but continuous with them, the same earth, the same hands in a different generation. Clara came for the occasion, which was not an occasion but which Clara declared one, arriving with George and Ruth and 2 additional children, a boy named James and a girl named Cecily, in a wagon loaded with more food than was strictly necessary because Clara had never believed in moderate hospitality. They spent 2 days at the ranch in the particular happy chaos of a large family that genuinely likes each other, and in the evenings the adults sat on the porch and the children ran the property in the long summer light, and Joel and Hazel sat side by side in the chairs that had replaced the original porch furniture years ago, and watched it all with a satisfaction that was too large for any single word. "Clara saved your life," Hazel said one of those evenings, quietly, so only Joel could hear. He turned to look at her. "Clara arranged a fraud that sent a stranger to the wrong town. And you were waiting at the stage with your hat in your hand," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Then, yes, I was. I'm glad you were." He reached over and took her hand and held it in the way he had been holding it for 10 years with the same certainty and the same gentleness, the hands that were known to her better than any other thing in the world. "I was glad before I knew why," he said. "The moment I saw you step off that stage, something told me before I had any reason to know." "That's not practical," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." She laced her fingers through his. The children's voices carried across the ranch in the evening light, William's deeper now at 9, Alice's bright and carrying, Ruth's laughter, James's running commentary on whatever was happening. The grass moved in the evening wind. A horse shifted in the corral. The sky above Kansas was enormous and clear and full of stars beginning to show at the edges. "What do you want that we don't have?" she asked him. It was a question she asked periodically, a way of taking inventory that he had come to understand as one of her fundamental practices, the refusal to assume that what existed was automatically sufficient. He thought about it seriously, the way he took all her serious questions. "Another 10 years of this," he said finally, "and another 10 after that. That's not very ambitious." "It's very ambitious," he said. "It's the hardest thing to keep, a life that's actually good." She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was something she did not do very often because they were not, either of them, people who performed affection for audiences, but the children were occupied and Clara was inside with George making enough noise to cover anything, and the evening was specific and golden and she wanted to be fully inside it. "The hard thing," she said, "is that I almost didn't come." "You came," he said. "I came to the wrong place." He pressed his mouth to the top of her head briefly, warmly. "The wrong stage," he said. "The right town." She smiled, closed-eyed against his shoulder. "Your sister would say she planned it that way." "She would," he said. "And she'd be lying, and she would not care in the slightest." From inside the house, they could hear Clara's voice rising in the middle of some story she was telling, and George's laughter, and then the unmistakable sound of a plate being set down too hard, and Clara saying something that made George laugh harder. Outside, William's voice could be heard explaining something to his cousins with great authority about the proper way to handle the horses, which he had been absorbing from Joel for his entire conscious life and was now distributing freely. "We should go in," Hazel said. "In a moment," Joel said. She stayed in the moment. She kept it. She would keep it for the rest of her life. This evening on the porch of the ranch they had built together, with the children making their noise and the stars coming in overhead and the grass moving, and the horses settled, and everything that had begun with a wrong stage, and a man with his hat in his hands now spread out before her in the shape of something real and lasting and completely, thoroughly good. In the years that followed, William grew into a young man who was recognizably his father's son in the best ways, careful and honest and gifted with the land, and who surprised them both by having also absorbed, from somewhere, his mother's talent for numbers, which he demonstrated at 13, by recalculating the ranch accounts on his own initiative and finding an error in the feed cost projections that saved them a notable amount of money. Joel looked at the corrected figures and then looked at Hazel with an expression she understood perfectly. "Don't say it," she said. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "You were going to say he gets it from me." "He gets it from you," he said. Alice, 3 years younger, was a different but equally particular character, bright and opinionated, and with a love of horses that rivaled her father's, spending every possible hour in the corral and the barn, developing a skill with the animals that drew Deke's replacement, a calm man named Eli, to remark more than once that she had a gift. She also had, from the time she could read, an unquenchable hunger for books that Hazel fed with the same diligence she brought to the kitchen garden. The lending library in Nora Twig's store got considerable use from Alice Sawyer. Hazel had a third child in 1890, another son, named Daniel, who was quieter than either of his siblings and had arrived into the world with a contained, watchful quality that reminded Hazel of Joel at his most still. He was a thinker. He was also, improbably, the one who turned out to have the best singing voice in the family, which he demonstrated unexpectedly at church one Sunday when he was 4, and the congregation turned with unanimous startled delight, and Hazel had pressed her fingers to her mouth to contain the laugh. The year 1895 brought changes. The ranch was 15 years established by then, a genuine institution in the county, known for the horses and the cattle and the Sawyer family whose word was understood to be a contract by itself. Joel had developed a reputation among the neighboring ranchers as a man whose counsel was worth seeking, not because he sought authority, but because he offered it so rarely that when he spoke, it was understood to mean something real. Hazel had become, without quite having pursued it, the unofficial financial advisor to several of the smaller operations in the area, the person neighbors came to when the accounts were tangled and the bank felt like a threat, and she helped them with the same practical directness she had always brought to everything. They rebuilt the main house that spring, extending the back to add a proper study for Hazel that was separate from the ranch office, which she had always used but which had always been Joel's space in its origin, and she had always known it. The new room was hers from the beginning, with a window that looked south over the kitchen garden and shelves built by Joel himself to hold the books that had multiplied beyond the original shelf in the front room. She stood in the completed room on the afternoon Joel declared it done and ran her hand along the smooth wood of the shelves and felt the specific pleasure of a space that was her own. "It took me long enough," he said from the doorway. "You've been building me things for 15 years, she said. "I think we can credit you with the pattern." He leaned in the doorway and looked at her with the expression she loved best, the full smile and the quiet eyes together, the combination that meant he was completely present in the moment and not defending himself against it at all. "I have something to tell you," she said. He went still in the way she knew. "Don't look like that," she said. "It's good news." The fourth child was born in December of 1895, a second daughter named Margaret, which was a name they had both held in their minds for a long time without saying it, And when Hazel said it aloud in the conversation about what to call the baby, Joel was quiet for a moment and then nodded once, with a great deal inside the nod. And she understood that this was a way of honoring what had been without it diminishing what was, and she thought it was exactly right. Baby Margaret was a round and cheerful infant who grew into a round and cheerful toddler, and who regarded the entire world with an openness and delight that made everyone around her happier than they had been before she entered the room. She followed Daniel everywhere, and Daniel, the watcher, the quiet one, took her presence with a patience that suggested he did not mind at all. The 20th century approached on the horizon of their lives, the way the storms came across the Kansas plain, visible from a distance, massive and real and bringing change. The world was shifting in ways they could feel even on the ranch outside Caldwell, the railroads and the new machinery, and the newspapers full of a country growing larger than anyone had planned for. Joel read the almanac and the papers and talked about it at the supper table with the same directness he brought to everything, not afraid of what was coming, not dismissive of it, just looking at it squarely and thinking about how the ranch was placed within it. In the spring of 1899, William Sawyer, age 16, rode to the south pasture to check the new fencing with his father, and they worked side by side through the afternoon, two men with the same careful hands and the same economical way of moving. And at the end of the day they rode back toward the house together, and the low sun turned the grass gold around them. And Joel looked at his son and felt the full weight of what had been built, not just the fencing and the ranch and the cattle, but the continuation, the living forward of everything. "What do you want?" Joel asked his son, the same question Hazel asked, the inventory question that had become part of the family's language. "That you don't have." William thought about it the way both his parents had always thought about things, seriously and without performance. "I want to know more," he said, "about the wider things, the business of it, how operations grow." Joel nodded. "We can arrange that," he said. "I don't want to leave the ranch." "You won't have to," Joel said. "The knowledge can come to us." This was how Hazel found herself, in the autumn of 1899, writing letters to agricultural colleges and business schools about correspondence courses and visiting lectures, constructing an education for her son that would serve the ranch he would one day run, with the same methodical intelligence she had always brought to every problem she was given. She was 43 years old, and her hair had some silver in it now, and she was the most competent person in any room she entered. And she had been at the Sawyer Ranch for 17 years, and she had never once regretted the wrong stage. On a September evening in the last year of the century, Hazel and Joel sat on the porch as they had sat on porches for 17 years, and the ranch was quiet around them, the children doing the things of their various ages inside and in the barn, and the stars were coming out above the Kansas plain, and the grass moved in the evening wind. "I want to tell you something," Joel said. She looked at him. He was looking at the horizon in the specific way that meant he had been thinking about something for a while and had found the words. "The day you arrived on that stage," he said, "I was prepared to explain everything and send you on your way and spend the rest of my life being angry at Clara. And then you stepped down and looked at me and said there had been several mistakes, like you were already solving them, and I thought," he paused, "I thought that whatever mistakes there had been, I wasn't sure I wanted them corrected." Hazel was quiet. "I've thought about that a lot," he said, "about how a life can turn on something so small, the wrong stage, a misdirected letter, a platform attendant not paying attention." He turned to look at her. "I spent a long time believing that things could only go wrong, that you build something and it comes apart and you keep the pieces and you manage. And then you stepped off a stage in the wrong town, and I understood that things can also go right. Unexpectedly and without plan, completely right." She looked at his face, this face she had been reading for 17 years, and she reached up and touched his jaw in the way she rarely did, because she was not a woman who performed tenderness, but this was real and she wanted him to know she received it fully. "You were standing there with your hat in your hand," she said, Like you were waiting for something you didn't know you were waiting for. I was, he said simply, and I was the wrong person in the wrong place. You were the right person in the right place, he said. The stage was wrong. Everything else was exactly correct. She leaned in and kissed him, briefly and warmly, in the way of people who have kissed each other enough times that it is familiar, and who have kissed each other carefully enough that it has never become less than it was. He kissed her back in the way he had from the beginning, with the same unhurried completeness that he brought to everything he valued. Above them, the stars spread across the Kansas sky, and the ranch stretched out in the dark around them. The horses settled, and the cattle quiet, and the house warm behind them with the children's voices carrying through the walls, and the kitchen garden resting through the September night with its rows still showing the last of the season's growth, and the fence lines running true in all directions across land that was theirs together, and had been theirs together for 17 years. Built from honesty and practicality, and the particular courage of two people who had looked at each other across a dusty street and decided to tell the truth. The wrong stage had been the best thing that had ever gone wrong for either of them. And Joel Sawyer, who had stood at the Caldwell stage with his hat in his hand, and a name on a piece of paper, and no expectation of anything but difficulty, had found the truest thing of his life arriving on the stage he hadn't planned for, in the form of a woman who had lifted her chin at a strange town and a stranger man, and said there had been several mistakes, and had meant, without knowing she meant it yet, that she was already working out how to turn them into something good. He held her hand on the porch in the September night, and she held his back, and they sat together in the life they had made, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything.